magical thing.
Grows where you are, it exists where you are.
An intentional journey to open up the pathways
To connect us to something bigger. It helps everybody in the equation.
has been the magic of the people, and it's passed from person to person.
You have to follow through. You have to do the thing. Like happy, safe place.
Is that your logic, or was that something you were told?
Focus on your craft and your practice. Just ask me why. Why in general?
Can you unteach yourself something that society has taught you?
Mystical experiences will always be different.
Your body is your temple.
You've probably been doing certain things your whole life.
You need nothing else other than what you're in right now.
This is Georgina. This is Nike.
And this is Temperance.
And welcome to Occultism with a Side of Salt.
Hello, this is Georgina.
This is Nike.
This is Temperance.
And you are listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how we fail beginners as more experienced practitioners. During the pandemic, which we've been in at the time we're recording for a solid year, the reality is a lot of people have entered the occult in this year. There's been a huge influx of people. And over the past 10 years, there's been a steady increase in more and more new practitioners every single year. And because of that, there's been a lot of more people interacting with beginners. No longer do beginners, for the first time interacting with a group, go on some Witchvox post, maybe their local Facebook group, and then find an open outer court circle. Now they're going straight to the internet and to talking directly to other practitioners. And I think we are, in a way, failing the new practitioners. I think in a lot of ways we've created a very inclusive environment. We're really questioning some things that have held up in the community for a long time and really making it more accessible. People have really counteracted elitism and stuff. But in a lot of ways, there are things that we are doing wrong and that I think we can do better as more experienced practitioners to make sure that beginners have a better foot. Some of these things are things that we as individuals can work on, and some are things the community can work on. Of course, this is not meant to be a lecture on how we're doing wrong. I'm honestly guilty of a few of the things we're going to talk about. It's just how we can make it a better community for our new practitioners. And if you're a new practitioner listening to this, you should really listen to this one, because we're going to be debunking some things that you may have heard, discussing some things that are sort of becoming mainstream dialogue in the community that are harmful for new practitioners, and really giving, a good, solid intro to those new and a discussion on how we can have better discourse to those who are around for longer. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about everything that we do that fails our new community members. We're going to be discussing our ways that we talk about resources, the way we police practitioners, activism, things that we should teach them early on, certain theory that they should be introduced to, how sort of the commercialization and the rise of social media has impacted our community, and all about exposing them to new things, UPG, and everything that I think the beginners are really missing out on hearing about. So let's break into it.
I want to start us off strong, all right? I have a hot take, and I've been guilty of it a few times, not gonna lie. I think everyone has when they're at the end of their day. But I think we fail beginners in a big way by when someone asks a question on a topic they're unsure of. You see this in forums, in Discords, in Instagram comments, in TikTok. What is this, or how do you do this, or whatever the thing is, and people just respond, just Google it. And that puts a lot of assumptions on, one, that they haven't already tried to research it, that they haven't tried to read about it. But a lot of those questions don't come from a place of malice, right? If someone says, I'm not sure about this, I don't know, they're not asking what Google thinks. They're trying to get actual advice from someone who may have already practiced it, who has practical tips and practical advice that they can use for their situation. So yeah, Google is a great resource and it gives you a great starting point, but no occultist has ever been, and no witch either, has ever been, advanced to the next level by just stabbing at it based off of a bad Google resource. There is a time where you have to ask someone your questions and have them be answered.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm actually guilty of. I've made jokes about, just Google it. I've responded to this to people. I've sent people Wikipedia articles in response to questions. I'm confessing my sins here. I've done this. And for a while, I definitely thought this was a decent response. I thought, they're asking a simple question. They should Google it before asking. And then I realized, and I looked at some of the stuff that come up when you Google these sort of basic witchcraft questions, and the top Google results sometimes are good, but a lot of the times they're not really helpful for someone who's trying to be a practitioner, right? Wikipedia, in general, I find covers occult topics surprisingly well. Britannia does decent stuff, but it doesn't, and of course, sometimes you'll get like an Hermetic library link if you're really lucky, but it's not the practical advice, and it's something that I think people could get really annoyed with, because typically the first few Google results are kind of like the same article pasted like 9 times. And I think beyond a very beginner understanding, the Google thing doesn't necessarily work, because when you're new, you actually sort of have to learn how to Google, right? Because looking up occult information is not as simple as like typing in an answer and getting a response, right? Because these are traditions that have largely been mysterious. So sometimes you have to learn like what websites are good to look at, because you don't want someone to just find like a spells of magic link and then read how to turn my cat into my familiar type stuff, because that stuff does come up. You find these clickbaity articles like 15 signs to be a witch, which are just like basic random descriptors. And that stuff comes up before things like Hermetic Library or Lux Attorney or Paradigm Grind, that are these websites that have a really high quality occult information. And I think some of these super new people, they don't really know how to vet yet, especially if they don't have like a background in reading, because I find most people go to the internet before they buy a whole book on something. I think that's kind of reasonable. You want to know what something is basically before you spend money on getting a 300-page book on it. It's the reality. That's what people do. And so I think we need to almost teach them how to Google, right? Like, how do we vet these beginner articles? How do we make sure they're looking at an occultist-made website and not some Christian website lamenting about how if you read tarot cards, you're going to hell, right? Because that stuff comes up pretty fast if you Google things, And I think that learning how to Google effectively as an occultist is a skill that a lot of super new people don't really have. And they probably get frustrated seeing the same 3 articles on Wicca and like what is a pentagram again and again and again ad nauseum.
See, I get to be the dissenting voice this time around, because I do admit to having done this in the past. I try to do it less now for more specific reasons, but I do still do it in specific cases, because as much as, yes, we're not going to be able to get them to like the actual, magical parts, and, there's still a lot of stuff that when I get a question that is literally, what is the difference between tarot and oracle, or like, what is tarot? What are runes? Things that, like, they're not asking about a practice, they're just asking for a literal definition of what a thing is. That's what I'm like, okay, you can Google it. I think it's more an issue of, like, beginners not phrasing their questions correctly, because maybe they're asking for something deeper, like, if they're asking the tarot versus oracle question. If the real question they're asking, like, inside is, how do you choose between them? Is one better or worse? Like, whatever variety of questions could come about it. If that's what they're thinking inside, but what they ask is, what is it? That's where this sort of, like, issue comes up. And I try to dig a little bit deeper, and instead of saying, like, Google it, I try more often now to ask what kind of digging they've already done into it, what kind of, like, research they've done, what their background is, how much they've already looked into it, to sort of gauge how much they've already done. Because if they've already done it, then great, we can just skip past that and figure out what's the actual question you're asking. But I mean, if I get somebody asking, what is Hermes associated with? What is Hera associated with? I mean, you can do step 1 of Googling. I try to push people more towards questions like in that camp of, if they're trying to ask what they're associated with, why? Are you doing your research into them? Do you want some sources to look into? Because that one you can also just Google, because Wikipedia, theoi.com, like there's a lot of places you can get those basics. It's the deeper questions that we don't see a lot, and I think it's because beginners don't know to ask or how to ask them, and that can be sort of a problem area. And I'm not sure how to fix that problem, because we can't catch them before they ask the what is it thing. There's no way to get to them to help them figure out those questions. So I try to guide them more in that direction. But if you ask me a definition question, I'm just going to tell you that Google exists. So
I mean, that's reasonable.
Yeah, like the definition stuff is the only area where I try to stick to that. Everything else I try to be a little bit more friendly and inquisitive about, because they're looking for guidance. I do want to help. That's why we're out here, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think like if someone's asking a very basic definition, that is definitely like when I think that's an appropriate response. I think that I've used it a little too much. I've been like, Google something before you even think about asking it. Like I think that is very dogmatic and ineffective. Like or like immediately saying if someone asks a question, like someone say, "Hey, I have a question," someone immediately responds, "Have you tried Googling it?" Like I do think that's a little dismissive.
Yeah, that's really dismissive. Although I think it would be helpful if I'm going to be the dissenting voice, I think, for this whole portion. I think that Googling it first could be helpful because then they could come in and say, I've already Googled it. I found these things. I still don't know what to think. If I hear that, then I'm definitely going to be down to answer because, like, clearly they've tried to do some legwork on it. And so I'll try to see what they've found out so that we can, like, talk through what they've found versus maybe what reality is or if there's a better source or whatever. So I think that in a lot of cases, just stating that they've Googled it first can be really helpful. And I do still stand in the court that you should try to Google it first. You might not find great results. Your results might be fucking garbage, but you can come in and say, this is what I've found. Is that correct? Or what are your opinions on it? I'd much rather hear that because I think that it shows the dedication to it. Because in my head, being a witch, being a magical practitioner, being an occultist, all the things that are in this realm, a lot of it's going to require doing your own legwork on it. And if I'm looking to help somebody out with it, if I'm looking to answer questions, we've all encountered people that they come in for 3 months, it was just a fad, and then they leave. I don't want to focus all my attention on the people that are doing it for the fad. I want to focus on the people who are dedicated enough to try to do some legwork. Maybe your legwork sucks. It could. Maybe you didn't learn how to Google properly, which is an issue that can be fixed. But I want to know that there's at least the effort put in rather than just asking everybody your questions first when they're very easily searchable things, especially in servers where you list resources.
Yeah, I get that. I think in general, the reason why we tend to do this, just Google it rather than listening to people, because I think we do say it a little too much, is because a lot of the time when people say it, and this is for more the beginners listening, who are kind of frustrated with people just constantly dismissing their questions or not answering them, is that people who are like us, who make a lot of content and are kind of community resources to new people, we get asked a lot of the same questions a lot. And so people get kind of tired, like emotionally, and get kind of, they feel like, oh my God, I'm tired of answering the 19th question about what is rune, or like people get the older practitioners get kind of like energetically tired and, you know what I mean? I think that's why people get dismissive. And I think sometimes we need to remember like, hey, I'm super burnt out of answering these questions. I should, take a break, not respond instead of like snapping on someone, like there's certain questions like I get DM'd probably like multiple times a day, like what is Thelema? And I don't respond to all of them because I know if I did, I would get really snappy probably and give like kind of bitchy responses or rude responses. And so I think as more experienced people, when we're interacting with these people asking these really basic questions, we should space that out and make sure we're not, burning ourselves out. Because when we're kind of burnt out, that's when we tend, or at least for me, tend to be a little harsher and snappier and snippier with the new people.
I mean, that's why I made my YouTube channel. I've spoken about that before. It's because I was answering a lot of the same questions, and I wanted to be able to just, like, because I didn't make it to, like, be big or anything. I figured my videos would get, like, 10 views and that'd be it. But it was so I could, like, answer a question I see come up a lot on the servers I was in, whatever community spaces I was in. And then instead of having to say it 17 times every time it comes up, I just send them a video and be like, there you go. These are my exact thoughts. Bing, bang, boom, done, easy, like, very simple. So I tried to mitigate that some, and it works really well, actually, being able to, like, link my exact thoughts, or at least thoughts I had at the time. I might revise certain things later. Being able to link my thoughts on a particular topic has been very useful. It happens quite frequently, and it does help me, because it is, like, an emotional, I don't want to say labor, but, like, a drain to have to answer the same, how do I know a deity's reaching out to me? What is tarot? Can I use this for that? What is this god associated with? Like, I don't want to answer that 17 times a day. Have a video instead. There you go.
I think that moves on to something that personally grinds my gears. And we made a whole episode on fear-mongering, but I think it's really important to touch on here. I think there's a lot of fear-mongering to new practitioners in our community, right? And I think it comes from a good place most of the time. Of course, there are the grifty people who say super dramatic things like if someone has your sun sign, they can kill you on TikTok to get thousands of clicks. But
I
in
want to
general,
interject with that real quick because it is so common, just as a quick note, because it'll take 5 seconds. Somebody can't hex you with your sun, moon, and rising. Most people can't even hex you with your full birth chart. They can use it as a tag lock, but most people don't know enough about astrology to even use it in the first place. You are fine. You are safe. I caution against it because there's other ways they can use it, but like just having a picture of just the wheel, you're safe. Just having your sun, moon, rising, you're fine.
yeah, and so I think that starting things like that, of course, that's grift. But I think from a well-meaning position, we sometimes fearmonger to a detrimental extent, right? Because I think it comes from a genuinely really good place to say, hey, certain things in the occult are kind of dangerous. You don't just whip out some random Enochian table and start reading that shit with no context. Like, that's a good way to, if you don't know what you're doing, like, you could get hurt. But I think we fearmonger to the extent where people are afraid of practicing and spend, God, I've talked to people who wouldn't touch ceremonial magic for like 3 or 4 years because they thought they needed that much experience to even touch it. And largely fearmongering, because this is my hot take. Typically, the worst thing that will happen from a ritual to you is that it won't work, right? Big accidents do sometimes happen, but they're very rare. It's very unlikely you're going to get hurt from the occult unless you're doing it super, super wrong, which typically the people who are super anxious and won't touch certain rituals for like 5 years are not in that category. I think that sometimes in our attempt to caution people, we end up creating a culture of fear where people are afraid of doing rituals, and I think that can hold people back.
I mean, yeah, I think fear-mongering is a huge issue. I've spoken on it in multiple episodes. I've spoken on specific instances. I mean, I am also guilty of it to an extent, and I still stand by that, like, deity work isn't necessarily for beginners, but it's also not like you need 5 years of it. Most stuff, there's always gray area. It's a gray topic in general. But yeah, I mean, I think I see, especially like for quote unquote baby witches, because I don't love the term, especially on like TikTok, the amount of fear mongering I see there, holy shit. I couldn't imagine. I couldn't imagine having TikTok be your introduction into witchcraft and being the thing that makes you want to do it, because you go from a cute little aesthetic jar spell where you set it in the sunlight, like making sun water or moon water, like going from that very gentle things, which is all fine and good. It's fine. Going from that to all the Moldavite videos, or saying that palindrome dates will bring up your trauma, or that the moon will make people murder, like jumping from one to the other. Yeah, I can't imagine how fucking terrifying that must be. It's all bullshit. It's all fear-mongering bullshit, and it's also why we stress basics so hard, like protection. But, like, if you're doing your basics, I don't think you have much to fear, and you're never gonna learn if you don't do it. You don't learn not to run around the table if you don't bonk your head once when you're little. You don't learn to be careful when you're running because, if you don't run, you can't scrape your knee to learn to be careful and to get your coordination better. Like, without doing, there's no learning. And you won't know what works in, like, a money spell or whatever if you're not doing a money spell. Like, you do have to do it, and it prevents people from ever practicing. I'm with you. I've seen people practicing for fucking 5 years. They're not even practicing beyond, like, meditation and the occasional protection spell, but they don't do anything else. They've been in 5 years. They don't want to touch deities at all. They don't want to do anything because they're so afraid of it backfiring. Meanwhile, I'd love for them to have the confidence of somebody who's been in for 6 months and thinks they're a master and is doing 12 domination rituals a week. Like, I'd love for you to have some of that confidence. Please do stuff.
I hope that every topic we have one person who dissents, because I'm going to dissent on this topic, and that I think that fear is healthy. And I also think that if fear overtakes your ability or desire to take part in witchcraft or the occult, that you probably shouldn't be doing it anyways. Like, I don't feel as though fear is something that you should just step over. I don't feel like you should step out of your comfort zone. No matter where you feel like your confidence is or your education is that if there's that internal voice that's telling you, I probably shouldn't be doing this right now, that's the voice that you should be listening to. Like, it's your path, and regardless of what anyone else on the internet is doing or what books are telling you to do, if your path is not in that direction and you're ignoring your intuition and you're ignoring your guides, like, that's it's not going to harm anyone but yourself. So I feel like I think there's actually a place for it. Do I think the way TikTok does it is good? No. It's very annoying as an outsider to watch. But overall, as a personal practitioner, I think that if you're having doubts or fears or whatever, whether they're substantiated or not, if that's preventing you from taking the next step, I think that's something that you need to be listening to versus pushing through.
I partially agree with you. So I do believe in the idea that fear is the beginning of wisdom. We should have a healthy bit of fear. I agree with that. I think that we shouldn't, get ahead of ourselves. And if you have like that visceral gut feeling that you shouldn't be doing something, listen to that, because your visceral gut feelings are generally your subconscious screaming at you. However, I do think if the reason why you're not doing something is because of the internet and because of what people are telling you and you're scared because of what others are telling you, then I do think you should push through it, because your intuitive fear versus the fear put on you because of things you are told, I think are very different, right? That intuition where you just know a situation is wrong, or like, I know I had once right before I did a ritual that I ended up not doing. My left eye started crying, like my tears just started running, and I didn't do the ritual, and I felt like I shouldn't have done it. And I'm glad I didn't do it now in retrospect. But I think if the reason you have fear is not your intuition, but what others have told you, I think that is something to push through. Because I think when we sort of get into the occult, especially if we come from a Judeo-Christian background, is that there's certain biases that we have to kind of break down and push past, especially if you move in a more pagan direction with time. And I think some fear does need to be pushed through, but certain fear you should listen to. I think fear is something we need to have a healthy relationship with. I think we should check in with our own connection to fear and our understanding of fear and how we experience fear pretty regularly.
I super agree with that last point, and it's something I see a lot with people who are raised really evangelical, raised sometimes in cults, like really, really severely religious households, where they're told it's all devil worship. If you get into it, you're going to hell and you'll get hurt, and demons will possess your entire life. Like, people who are raised in that way get that fear from an outside source of misrepresenting what the occult and what witchcraft and what spirituality all is. Some people, even like the real extremes, will be like, yoga's of the devil. Don't do yoga even for exercise. Like the real strict people, it's a whole thing. And I think, yeah, like that's the kind of fear you need to push through. And when I've encountered those people, the tact I usually go for, and that I see other people going for, is introducing them to like Christian branches of mysticism, like folk magic, Christian-based branches of things that are familiar, working with angels, working in Abrahamic sects. Like, I think getting them to be comfortable with magic is okay and it's part of Christian history helps them to slowly branch out, and it helps them tackle that fear, because that kind of fear is not founded on anything that is realistic most of the time. Now, if your intuition is just like gut feeling, I shouldn't do this, shouldn't go here, shouldn't mess with this thing, follow that. Go right ahead. But if it's because you've been told your whole life how to think about something, I hate to like say this because it's so overplayed, but like maybe a little shadow work, maybe therapy. That specific one, like religious-based stuff, therapy would be really helpful to work through some of that, but also just some internal work.
Okay, Nike, what's your hot take?
Let's see. I know no theory is Georgina's. I love the performative activism point, so I'm going to go for that one. Another way that we really let down people who are new to the occult and to witchcraft is super performative activism. And it's a really hard topic to tread because, as we've said before on other topics, obviously we are three white girls, or it's just how we are. And so it's very hard to speak on it. But I can speak from the queer perspective that there's a lot of areas where people are trying really, really hard to be well-read, well-spoken, to be aware, and they want to treat people right, and they want to be respectful, which is great. I love that for them. I love that for our community. There's a lot of ways in which we overstep in that, and I mean we like the royal we, like as a general community. We spoke about it with J. Allen Cross. We spoke about it with Lilith Dorsey. There are people who go so far into trying to be activists and to be aware that they end up, in a way, discriminating. We spoke about horseshoe theory with things being closed to race turning into white supremacy. We spoke about it with J. Allen Cross specifically about books. We spoke about it, I think, with Lilith too, about supporting POC authors, but then going full on horseshoe and saying you're not allowed to buy those books because you're not of that race or ethnic background. It becomes this really weird thing. And then it becomes, quite often, people who are not part of that group speaking for and over that group as to what that group wants and needs. A lot. We see it with Judaism, we see it with queer people, we see it with black people, we see it with everybody, every group that is part of the occult. And it's a larger problem with the world, but we're talking about the occult space. A lot of times it ends up being cis straight white people talking about what minorities want in any way. And it's not the way to be doing it, and it's not centering those voices, and it's really fucking frustrating to make it seem like that's the way that magic's supposed to be done, because it makes it feel like no part of witchcraft is available to you. I've fucking seen people say that astrology is closed, when so much of the modern practice is almost entirely based on the Greeks. And it's really frustrating, because it's like, what the fuck are you doing? You are making actual activism look like fucking bullshit. And I get really stressed about it. I get really frustrated with it. Not stressed, but it's frustrating, because it's like, you're making us all look like a joke. You're making every issue look like a joke. And when someone actually wants to bring up one of these issues, you then get lumped in with the people who are basically just being woke scolds.
Well, it's a very misinformed thing. So what it is it comes from a good place, right? I am super grateful that our community is questioning these things, right? The occult community has a long history of discrimination. It just does. We have an alt-right episode where we talk about that. But there have been a lot of problems in the mainstream Western occult community, and I'm really glad people are addressing it. The thing is, people are addressing it in a way that just is not productive, right? People who are talking out about the experiences that they have, the discrimination they've experienced, way that they feel they've been appropriated, amazing. The issue is the people who are causing these problems are generally not of that group. I saw a message today that said, well, Jews are not necessarily able to speak on Judaism because they're not the Jews who can. And I was like that, and they said that to someone who was practicing a certain practice. So, and I've also seen a woman who was indigenous get called out for doing indigenous spirituality, and she said, well, I'm half indigenous. I was raised in indigenous culture. And the person said, well, you're not fully indigenous. And the person commenting this was white. And if you look up the hashtag closed practices tag on TikTok, you see a lot of people who are not of these groups speaking for the groups rather than letting the people from the groups defend their points. And then I see people who are making genuine, great posts about cultural appropriation that are true, and they get sent, people are like, ha ha ha, you're just like those girls who are trying to close tarot, and they use that as a bludgeon against real activists online, people who are like, hey, I'm really tired of seeing my, genuine examples, and it's used to silence them. And so in an attempt to be really well-informed activist, it's caused people who are other activists to get truly silenced and get treated as a farce. And it's really disrespectful. I think if you're making super broad statements for a group of people you're not part of and you're not talking to people from that group, it's probably not the best idea. And as well, I think that people who are new, this really, it rubs off on them, and they feel very confused and very kind of lost. And it leads people feeling like, I don't know, I think that it's causing new practitioners to be really worried about things. I know people have said that you cannot buy books by POC authors, because if you're not a POC, you should not buy POC books, which harms the sales of the POC authors who are struggling to make it in our community and struggling to write literature. And of course, when literature is not bought, it does not get published again. And I've seen people being like, oh, you can't read things about certain cultures, which it's been proven time and time again that learning about cultures creates more tolerance. And you can't know what not to do that's insensitive without knowing the culture's basic ideas. How can you know not to be insensitive if you don't know anything about the people? And I think it's caused a lot of real damage. I think that there's a lot of good work being done, and I'm so glad we're having these conversations. But I think we should be careful about whose voices we promote and make sure that we're not, in an accidental way causing harm.
I think one of the biggest ways that performative activism actively harms beginners into the occult and witchcraft spaces is that it teaches them to disregard nuance. Because when we get into occultism, there needs to be that gray area. Occultism is not black and white. And so when we get these people coming in, and they're coming in off of whatever avenue they came into, most likely through the internet, and the internet's telling you, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, this is closed, you're actively harming these communities by learning this thing. We're disregarding the nuance to what all those things are. Where is their shared culture? Where is it open? Where is it closed? How do we respect the closed spaces? How do we lift up those people in those places? And by disregarding the nuance, we really do ourselves such a big disservice, because occultism is so multifaceted, and we're literally just skimming the surface if we ignore it.
Well, it disregards a lot of historical context too. I mean, because it's recent and it's on my mind, and I'm just like, the talk about astrology is closed because this or that. The arguments are like, well, astrology existed in these places, and looking at the stars, like the systems were used by this or that culture. The main take is like, it was in Mesopotamia, and it was in Egypt, and it was in India, and it seems to insinuate that the Greeks stole it. But the reality is that they're disregarding all of the history. So there's the history of all the astrological systems were different and had different bases. So you're not even talking about the same thing as what you would be thinking about as astrology today. And what they were, like Mesopotamian astrology, did not have a lot of the stuff that Hellenistic astrology had or that Indian astrology had. So that system's going to be really different. And the history ends up being about like how the empires of that time spread. It was the Greek and the Roman empires, about how texts moved around, the Indian system, or systems, because there's a lot of branches and it gets really complicated. They had some crossover because there was a book that was brought over, and a lot of the terms that were then used in certain parts were basically just transliterated Greek, so it became a blending of the Indian astrology they were already doing and some of the Greek concepts, the empire spreading into Egypt and into the Persian Empire and all the cultural crossover. They're disregarding the fact that yes, conquest is bloody and forceful, and it's not great, to say the very least. But there's also disregarding the fact that scholars were speaking to each other, and we have records of this. There seems to be this implication that anytime that a POC culture meets what we now consider white culture, that it must be conquest, it must be colonial, it must be awful, it must be racist. That's what it is. Anytime black people meet white people, anytime Asian people meet white people, anytime any non-white culture meets a white culture, it must be awful. And it's not the case. And it's ignoring the history that we do know and we do have. And it leads people to think that every one of these things is bad, and could even then lead to people disregarding anything from that culture. So anything Greek, suddenly throw it out the window, despite it being really important to a lot of history. So throwing out the history is just a really stupid, bad take to have. Yes, there's bad people in history, there's bad conquest, there's white supremacy and colonialism. There's also cases where that doesn't happen.
Rome isn't the same thing as Greek. I just want to put it out there. Rome is not the same thing as Greek.
Well, there's also a big misunderstanding of religious anthropology, because we talk a lot when we talk about European paganism, how certain gods moved around. How that happened was not consistent, right? How certain gods moved is different, right? Like sometimes, like people, the cults literally like moved locations for various reasons. Like the cult of Dionysus was doing their Dionysian running around and fucking and shit. Like they were doing whatever. And then you have cases where when countries would, like Rome would conquer an area, they would take a local god and make it a Roman god, right? Those are very different things. And when we talk about like cultures evolving, there's a difference between someone coming across a text or certain mystics talking to each other and genocide. And I think when we say everything is stolen, because some stuff is stolen, that is true, it discounts the pain that cultures that were actually erased face. Because when you say, let's say like the PGM, when the Greek mystics interacted with some of the Semitic Jewish mystics, that was really terrible. that really discounts situations where, like, hoodoo was literally violently suppressed, right? I think it oversimplifies religious history. And I think in general, we do need to look at our history a little better rather than saying whenever religions syncretized, which sometimes religions did syncretize peacefully, right? Sometimes they did, sometimes they did not. History is not black and white. There's no one way religion evolved. And I think we have a situation where we really don't pay attention to that history and just immediately assume cultural exchange is bad. Some wasn't exchange and some was exchange. And I think we need nuance in a lot of space, in a lot of this whole discourse.
And that's
Well,
where we
it seems
fail
to
beginners.
True. Well, I think it also like sort of infantilizes these the cultures that we would now consider to be like, because it's often from the American perspective, right? So when I say minority cultures, I mean minorities within America. That's where I'm coming from. So it sort of infantilizes these minority cultures, where it seems like everything related to like magical history, occult history, world history, it's always big, strong, tough, intelligent, well-manned, strategic white people coming into poor, backwards POC cultures, and they lost because they were just so much weaker. And like it's this weird thing of it makes it seem like all POC cultures were weak and unable to fight off the terrible white people. And it's not really that case. It's really just ahistorical. I mean,
look at the Vietnam War.
World history is really complicated, especially when it comes to like the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Egyptian Empire. Like all of that is a whole thing. Too much to get into, but like it really does fail people to just make it seem like it's an easy blanket, this culture bad, this culture good, because even cultures who have been marginalized often have bad parts of their own history, and it's just we need more nuance. Just generally, we need more nuance in the conversations about the activist things we're trying to do, and we need to see it from more than an American perspective.
And research the claims you see online. Research what we're saying, you know? Like, if you see a big claim, like let's talk about the person when they said tarot was closed, right? Like, if you research that, you can find that that's not true. If we ever say anything that's not true, you can research it and call us out and we'll make a correction. I think in general, you should not immediately trust what people tell you, and you should always double check. And that moves me to my next point that I really wanted to talk about in a way that I think beginners are failed. And that almost has to do with this has to do with sort of the literature that we give beginners and kind of like modern occult books and occult discussions. And that would be, and this is specifically talking about witchcraft, because people who are listening who may not have been listening for a while, I'm a ceremonial magician. I'm not a witch. But I've spent a lot of time in witch spaces. And I think the ceremonial magic community is significantly better about this. But I think the witchcraft community, I think, could really benefit from it. And that would be theory and learning why magic works. I think a lot of the time we see instructions and we see books talking about traditions and histories and whatever, but people don't bring up the why. Why are you doing your rituals how you are? What do these things represent? Because all the time when we look at these beautiful little spells and rituals that people are doing, they're done for a reason. Like when we talk about calling the corners, like a lot of beginners, you know, since they get a Wicca introduction, they go, I have to call the elemental corners. But they don't know that the actual Wiccan corner calling practice is inspired by the Golden Dawn's calling of the watchtowers, which connects to Enochian magic. And when you learn these mechanics, it makes a lot more sense and you really understand like the components of ritual. One that I think that I'm going to explain right now, because I've talked to a lot of beginners and I've asked them directly, do you understand this concept? And I think that it's why a lot of people's base under the first magical theory I think anyone should learn is the microcosm and the macrocosm. So your ritual is what we would call a microcosm, and the whole world is the macrocosm. So let's use astrology. Let's pivot to that. So if you believe that the movement of the stars can impact our small everyday lives, you believe that something far away impacts the small. And so when you take a poppet and you tie it to another poppet ritualistically to signify them coming together, you're signifying two people, which are outside of your space, being brought together by your string. So what is in your small space impact the big space and vice versa. And this is one of the most foundational concepts in Western magic. It's called the microcosm and the macrocosm, but it's summed up in a lot of senses as above, so below. people don't explain what that is from, and that represents this concept. And I think like ideas like that are really important to explain to people rather than just feeling like they're following the Betty Crocker witch cookbook based on videos and stuff they've seen online. I think people need to learn why they're doing things. People say, oh, you should do a ritual on a full moon. We should explain why we care about astrological timing. Like, why does the full moon mean this? Not you do it on the full moon. I think beginners, and I think honestly, a lot of modern occult literature is lacking this theory. And the truth is, when you start writing your own spells and writing your own rituals and really advancing, that theory becomes really important because ideally, if you're a folk practitioner, you're going to start creating your own, practices and stuff and creating your own workings. You don't want to be following, step by step forever. And learning these things are really, really important. I don't think you need to go as hard as like ceremonial magicians go when we get into like the reasons why you knock 3 times because of the Sephirah on the Tree of Life, and you say certain things in certain tones to represent, you know what I mean? Like ceremonial magicians get really hardcore about this stuff. But I think a basic understanding of magical theory is really important. I think sometimes when we learn this, we have to turn to older occult books, which can be intimidating. But I think this is one of the most critical things to learn. And I really feel like our new practitioners are being sort of disadvantaged by not having this explained to them early on.
I think I'm going to bounce into that with a similar topic. But I think that we disservice beginners by policing the literature that they can read. Like, you're given certain books are good and certain books are bad, and certain authors are bad and certain authors are great. And that doesn't really leave a lot of room, right? Because if you've written a book, if you've written anything online, it doesn't have to be a book. Not every piece of literature is for every reader. Not every reader is going to connect to every voice. And the way that things are taught are not going to be universally understood. So I think that it's been around like since I've been in the community, like even in the early 2000s, there was like all these authors that you stayed away from because it was like fluffy bunny books and you didn't read these things and you read these instead. And I think that when we police the literature, we take away people's opportunity to learn those things, because some really good theory that I've personally learned have been from books that people told me had no value. I think every book should probably be given a fair chance, because just because you didn't connect to that book doesn't mean someone else is not going to connect to it.
Oh, I so strongly agree, and it's a problem that I run into in sort of every direction on the like policing the literature, and on like not teaching things. Because when we were talking about this originally in more of like a private setting, Georgina didn't believe us when we were like, no, nobody fucking talks about the microcosm, macrocosm. Nobody says it like that. Like, nobody teaches us. She straight up like went into we call it Yeet. It's the Coven of the Magical Yeet. It's a fan server for the Witch Wonderlist. And it's a little bit more of just like straight up witchcraft, a little bit softer, which is fine. But she was just straight up like, do you guys not know this? Who knows this? Show of hands. Who knows what this means? And almost nobody there did. And it's like, yeah, nobody fucking tells us this. I'll straight up admit, I think it was like last year or the year before, time for me with quarantine. Within the last 2 years was when I finally connected, like, as above, so below, to microcosm, macrocosm, and what that meant. It was like, I understood it conceptually, but the actual wording never, like, connected for me. And it's just because nobody ever says it. Nobody ever puts it into words that this is what this means. As above, so below means microcosm, macrocosm, which means what you do here in this ritual space affects the greater universe, basically. Like, nobody says it, and so that's a thing that we do a giant disservice. Same thing with the moon, 100%. When I was first getting into witchcraft, the reason I didn't stick around with it the first go-around, because it took me a couple tries to, like, fully jump in, was because it was just that. It was like, you do this, and that gets you these results. Nobody ever said why. Nobody ever said what the connection was. Nobody said anything about why any of it worked. Anyway, like, not even, like, why the ingredients worked and why they were connected with things, but just, like, why doing any of it has any reason to work. Nobody ever explains the why. So a lot of people, I think, probably were in my camp, possibly permanently, where they run across this stuff and they just go, but it doesn't, like, none of it makes any sense. Why would this happen? Why does this have any reason to happen? If I do this spell, why is that going to get me what I want? So a lot of people leave, or they don't ever fully get it. And so that lack of understanding leads to a lack of, like, it's a little abstract, but go with me. I think it leads to a lack of creativity later because they think that it must be formulaic because they have no idea how to put it all together themselves because they don't understand the base concept of putting it together. They just know, I do this with these things in this way on this moon phase. That's how I do it. That's it. And there's no understanding of why, because if you don't know the why, you can't abstract it. You can't expand out and say, okay, well, and if this other thing does this, and I could do it on this other moon phase for this other reason, and I could connect them that way, and you could take the concepts you already know and apply them in different ways. I think it leads to a lot of people being really formulaic. And the same thing with literature. It's going to be a little controversial for you, Temp. I love you. I don't think that all algorithm books are terrible if the information is right for those who are much, much newer. I think if you need a beginner book to get into and just have some really fucking basic information, I think they're fine. And I think that a lot of people push away from these super beginner basics, maybe sometimes algorithm books, because they are so basic and algorithmy, but I think that if the information is correct, and I think even if they're really basic, it can lead them into other places. So, like, I'll suggest Mystic Dylan's book, which is, I think it's Rockridge Press, which is an algorithm publisher. But I can lead them from, if they like Mystic Dylan's book, I can bring them to Madame Pomita's book. I can bring, other books in that way. I can slowly, like, edge them into other things because they have to read something. They have to start somewhere. And I think it can help lead them. I do lead people away from certain books because they're just, like, socially terrible. Like Lisa Lister's book, which is just, like, bad in every way. I tell people why I think it's bad, and if they want to read it, they can. I just say that I don't recommend it because I don't think it's any good. But I don't say, this is banned, you could never, ever read it. I just say, get it secondhand if you can. Don't give her any more money. That's my feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that earlier on we should expose people to some books with theory in them. I don't think we should do the whole thing that some ceremonial magicians online like to do where they say, you need to read Agrippa's 3 books of cult philosophy immediately, which, if you've ever read Agrippa, it's very good. But it is basically like reading the lawnmower manual of occultism.
I don't know,
right?
you're saying it's very good, but it literally is the lawnmower manual. It's not even, like, entertaining. It's dry. It took me months to get through the first one.
Yeah, it's not exactly like I get really annoyed when my fellow ceremonialists recommend, like, Agrippa to a super new practitioner, or recommend the Corpus Hermeticum, which the Corpus Hermeticum is a phenomenal book. It's also entertaining to read. But if you don't understand, like, some basic historical context, you won't know how to extract any practices out of it immediately. But I think we do need to give, like, harder books. If you're going to recommend a hard book to a newbie, Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic by Aletheus LeVay, because the entire first half explains why magic works and all the reasons why we do the things we do. It's entirely explaining the whole point of it. That, I think, is a hard book to give to beginners. And I think we should recommend, like, harder books earlier on. If you want to give a book with some theory to a super new beginner, give them The Black Arts by Cavendish, because that has theory in it, and it's, like, beginner friendly. It's even got a little bit of edginess in it for those who have a guilty pleasure for darker, kind of edgy, you know what I mean? It's from the 70s, it's called The Black Arts, it's got an edginess to it. But it does explain, like, theory really well. But yeah, I think that we should wait a little bit, but I don't think we should wait forever and say these books are advanced. But yeah, we should, I agree. I think, though, that those beginner books are good for your first book. I don't think you should give Agrippa to an absolute beginner. Crucify me for it. My beginner book recs, I've done them quite a few times. I recommend some for people who are willing to start with dry stuff and some for people who would rather not. Also, like, in general, probably the first book you read is not going to be the best book you ever read. But
My first book was terrible.
My first book was, I don't want to talk about it. It was not good.
We've already tweeted about it. The world already knows.
Yeah, the first 2 books I read were The Kabbalion and a big green book. I don't even know what it's like. It's called, like, Paganism, and I got it at a public library. It's, like, big and green. It's just like a generic book from like the 90s about the history of paganism. You know, it's okay. It's not great, but it's not terrible. But I also want to bring up something called about new practitioners who are on Discord may encounter called author blacklist. Yeah, so a rising trend that I see on beginner-oriented Discord
But this
servers
isn't new. I would like to point out this isn't new. This has been going on, like I said earlier, with the whole fluffy bunny movement of the early 2000s. This is just a new form of an old tradition.
An old tradition of saying, you can't read this book! It's like, so I don't know if you guys grew up in the, like around, like, kind of Christian people, but it's like, when there was that one kid you knew who's like, I can't read Harry Potter because parents say it's bad. It's like that type of thing, but occult. But basically, there's these big lists now of books you cannot read, and it has, like, a one-sentence description of why. And I think that's not a good move, because I think sometimes we need to read text we disagree with. It expands our mind. I've read a lot of books that I really disagree with, and reading it has either changed my perspective or made me double down and go, yeah, I don't connect with this at all. You're wrong. Haha, I'm so smart. But I think that you can't explain why a book is bad in one sentence. And I think when we're talking about, I don't think any books should necessarily be avoided. I think certain books you should be cautious around. And some of the books they've listed, personally, I don't have a huge problem with them listing, but I do think it can go too far. And I think, like, just because someone tells you not to read something doesn't mean you shouldn't. And maybe you're going to agree with their point. But I think books are nuanced, and there's good and bad in most books. Some are just, not cool. And that's like Lisa Lister's Witch is, of course, an example. Or like any of Evola's work, or someone who's just objectively, like, hateful or something. Like, that's very different. But I see books, like, people have listed, like, Scott Cunningham as to avoid, because the books from the 90s, there are certain things now that are not really, like, that are not really held up. And I think we should view books with nuance. And when we're reading older books, I mean, we have to remember the context of the time. When we read any book, we're having a little glance into someone's life, right? And some of our most foundational books, there are certain things that modern occultism disagrees with. And there's certain modern books that traditional occultism agrees with. And that's okay, and I think we should be willing to read all sorts of things. I think that something that I've suggested to beginners is to read things outside of your practice. Especially people who get into witchcraft, because they think witchcraft is all there is in magic. They don't know about mysticism, they don't know about ceremonial magic, they don't know about folk magic. They just know about witchcraft, and they assume everything is witchcraft. And then, this happened to me. Like, I was a witch at first, right? I was into folk magic and witchcraft. And a little while into it, I realized about ceremonial magic, and I really wish I had been exposed to it earlier on, because it would later become my entire path and really, instrumental in changing my life. And so I think we should open our minds. Like, let's say, like me, like, I have zero interest or connection to Norse paganism. I just don't. This is my shade at Nike, because Nike's into the Norse stuff. But I just don't connect with it. And so I read a book. It was a really good book on Alsatru. Alsatru by Aaron Lale. Aaron Lale, that book. It's very good. And I was like, oh, it really, it made certain other practices make sense to me. I realized that I'm not a Norse pagan and never will be. But, it gave me context, and it gave me some information that really helped me in understanding things. And I think that we should open our minds and read books that may be controversial. Like, Mastering Witchcraft by Hewson. It's very edgy and polarizing, but it's foundational and influenced a lot of traditional witchcraft and is sort of the basis for that. And I think we should be open to reading these titles.
I want to bring up Silver Ravenwolf. Okay, I want to bring her up because when I was, like, getting into reading early on in my practice, she was, like, it was a different time, and Discord wasn't even invented yet, but she was definitely on, like, a do not read list, because people were like, oh, like, it's fluffy, you're not going to get anything from it, or what. There was a whole slander campaign against Silver Ravenwolf, and I genuinely think that a lot of the hate that she got, I don't think she deserves it first. It took me years to put aside my bias, because I was told so harshly, like, don't read her. It took me a long time to put that aside and read some of her work, to recognize that a lot of her slander came from misogyny. Okay, occult men hate when young women have things. Like, I don't know why. That's just a thing. You can disagree with me. I don't care if you disagree with me, because I'm a young woman who occult men hate has things, okay? So I've personally experienced this. Every single person on this podcast has.
I am the first young woman to be a Thelemite on social media, and I surpassed the biggest Thelemite on social media. That's my flex. Fuck Augustus Sol Invictus. I'm gonna cut that out. Sorry. But yeah, I mean, like, I get so much shit for being a young woman. It's the men in our community, and we have a whole episode on misogyny, are very intimidated. And I actually saw a Twitter thread the other day that sort of echoed this sentiment. It was about Gen Z occultist. And it was someone basically admitting, I had a problem with Gen Z occultists because they intimidated me. And so I tried to say that we should not platform them, basically. And I think that it comes from a place of maintaining a status quo, because I think when you're someone who's been a community member for a super long time, and you see young, and people don't take women as seriously, people don't treat femininity as serious. They assume if you're feminine, you're vapid and stupid. And there's a lot of cultural stuff that goes into that. They suppress it, and they try to stamp it out of the community, and it comes from a place of fear. And Silver Ravenwolf, I have not read much of her work, I'll confess it, but I have some serious props for her for staying in the community through all that, and she inspired so many people. Like, I don't necessarily love her books because it's not my style. I think she's a great writer. I think her books are great. But she's inspired some of my heroes in the occult community, and some of the people whose books I've been so deeply inspired by were inspired by her. And we really, we kind of owe a debt to her, because without her, the 90s boom wouldn't have brought some of our favorite teachers and leaders into the community.
Oh, 100%. And that's, I mean, that whole thing is part of why I try to say specifically the phrase, I don't recommend, rather than do not read. It's just not something that I would steer people towards, but people are free to read it. And yeah, I think, especially with Silver Ravenwolf as a specific example, I think it's really important to read, not just because, she was a big name in the 90s, but also on that point about inspiring so many of the people that are community leaders now. Like, I know Matt Oren, Devin Hunter, Temp, obviously, like big community names who are even just a little bit older than Gen Z. Like, if you're not 20, if you're in your later 20s or in your 30s or 40s or 50s, she's probably a big influence during the time that you were coming into it or that you were developing or whatever. Being so influential, I think it's important to read the works that influence the people that you are influenced by, because you need to know some of their background, some of their history. I don't think you can properly understand them without understanding the things that they had as a foundation. If there was a book that was super important to my early practice and somebody was really inspired by me, I would hope they would want to go read that to see what about that book was so important. What about it inspired them? Where can I see some of that still in their work? And you can see their work evolving over time. I think that just straight up ignoring it, with very, very, very few exceptions, is kind of a weird idea. I get it if there's cultural appropriation or transphobia, like Lisa Lister, or whatever other thing.
Evola. Straight up Evola. I will say the one author who I do think it's kind of inexcusable to recommend is Evola, because he is a fascist. He literally identifies as super fascist. He's fucking dead now. I can shit talk him all I want. But he was involved in Benito Mussolini seizing power, and he wrote some books on Hermeticism. And I do think it's kind of yikes when people recommend his books.
It's a great tip-off. You can always know who's into the fascist and Volkish type writings, depending on who they recommend and why.
Yeah, Evola, out of any person to not recommend, I'm just gonna name and shame Evola, because there's really no way to excuse Evola. Evola said Hitler is too moderate. That's a quote. He said, I don't agree with the Nazis, they're too centrist. So I do find it actually alarming when people recommend his books on Hermeticism. Even if, I don't know. That is the one author I will give my caveat for.
But that's an understandable thing, right? But, the caveat, do I think that everything that Silver Ravenwolf has written is fantastic, amazing? No, I don't, okay? And she's also not my flavor. She's a Wiccan writer. I'm not Wiccan. So, and it took me to be an adult to read her work. But, do I think that she deserved, after reading it as an adult, do I think she deserved the hate that she got? Absolutely not. I think that she made a lot of men uncomfortable, and that's why she got a lot of hate. Like, she specifically wrote books aimed at girls. That was, like, not a thing. So, I mean, I can, like, before Silver Raven Wolf, I can list maybe 5, 6 female witches and or occultists that were very publicly known. Like, so, yeah, that's my I don't think Silver got the hate she deserved rant.
Yeah, it's not like Silver Ravenwolf like was a fascist. Silver Ravenwolf just was kind of love and lighty at times and wrote books for teenage girls.
Okay, well, my final thoughts are that I think beginners are misled by the internet, and if you want to get on a good foot, if you're super invested in your personal journey, if this is not a fad to you, if you want to, and if you're listening to our podcast and you're this many episodes deep, it's probably not, but if you are really invested in your personal journey, venture out into the physical world, find a bookstore, find a group, find something, connect with another living person, and start your direction from there. I think the internet's going to mislead you way faster if you take it at surface level.
I'll go now and then I'll do patrons after Georgina. So, my final thoughts are that you shouldn't let the fear of other cultures and insulting other cultures stop you from research, because there's never any harm in learning. Learning about other cultures is good. Learning about world history in connection to those cultures, especially if you're trying to look into the magical histories of those cultures, is important. You should do it. You should learn about other cultures. Practicing is different from learning and understanding. And I think that we get so scared of being called racist, we get so scared of being called insensitive or whatever, that we just end up never learning out of fear, and that only creates misunderstanding. Please learn about other cultures, because it is the best way to learn about the rest of your community. You don't have to practice if you're learning something. Just reading and learning about it from people from those cultures is going to be great. Do it, please.
My final thoughts are the occult is a history of heresy in a lot of ways. Very few occult practices were perfectly in line with the status quo and what general culture wanted. Even the good boy of Western esotericism, John Dee, who was employed by the literal Queen of England and was about as approved as possible, had a slander campaign ran against him by a person named Macrocosm, total TikTok troll of that time, of Elizabethan England. Fuck him. And he slandered this man. Hard. Like, I mean, said he was secretly having sex with the devil style stuff, which back then, not exactly the stuff you want written about you. Occultism is a long history of people, like the Gnostics were straight up heretics. These orders were suppressed by certain governments. You know, occultists have always kind of been on the ideological fringes, right? We've been going against an orthodox grain for the majority of time. And even traditions like Kabbalah have been rejected by certain, like Christian sects, and they're very much Abrahamic stuff. If you are seeking approval from everyone around you for what your practice should be, you're depending on the ideas of others, you're depending on the approval of others. Remember our history, Occultism is a long series of people going against what they're supposed to do. It's people, like in the case of witchcraft and folk magic, it's poor women and poor people taking back their power to empower them and help them gain a better societal status, right? These occultists like the Thelemites and the members of the Golden Dawn, especially when the Thelemites broke off, like they were seen as kind of crazy and looked down upon, and there were whole magazine spreads about how terrible these people are. But none of it was true, and we know now as occultists that they were people seeking information, gnosis, and closeness to God, and people in spirituality, since spirituality is so opinion-based, can intimidate others. And I think we should try not to seek approval of others in our practice, because we are on a foundation of heresy and a foundation of people having critical thought and reading Apocrypha and doing rituals in the dark, because if their shops found out, they could get, pressed against in the Satanic Panic or something. That's our history. That's what we come from. That is our lineage. We are not a socially accepted group of people. We're still not. I mean, look at that woman who was fired from Panera recently for being pagan. We are not those who will ever be approved by the majority. And I think within our community, we shouldn't seek that same approval that we want from the outside world. We need to be able to be independent and think on our own and have our own, critical thought. Because all this boils down to the whole goddamn point of esotericism is connecting to God or to the divine on your own time and not being told what to believe by a pastor at the front of the room. And that is why occultism intimidates people, because it's people connecting with the spirituality on their own level without being given that instruction by an authority. And that scares people. And I think we shouldn't fall into this orthodox mentality where we listen to the people in our communities rather than doing it on ourselves. Because in the end, it does not matter what people on the internet think about you or what other occultists think about you. What matters is what happens alone between you and the divine. That is what matters. That is the point of gnosis. Because gnosis does not happen on TikTok. Gnosis does not happen when you're talking to your friends and they're telling you how much you've learned and grown. Gnosis is what happens when you are alone, in the dark, burning your candles, doing your rituals, doing your spell work, understanding that big moment where you understand a new astrological concept and suddenly things in your life that you've never understood finally make sense to you. And that is on your own terms. That is not on the terms of others. And I just want to leave us with that, right? When you're a beginner, in the end, what matters is you and the divine. That comes first. That is before everything else. And that is the whole point of occultism. If you're in occultism because you want to perfectly follow the map that others have laid for you, this may not be the exact field for you, and that's okay. And I just recommend tread out, go a little crooked, push yourself, understand these concepts, and just do it. Experience your UPG and trust your UPG and have those experiences that make occultism worth it and are the reasons why any of us are here. So, this has been Georgina. If you want to support Occultism with a Side of Salt and keep this going, we have a Patreon where we do extra episodes, extended shows, video versions, if for some reason you want to see our faces, and pre-shows for every show. Our pre-shows are especially fun. They're some of my favorite things that we create. And now let's turn to Nike to thank our patrons.
Because we forget often, and by we I mean me, because it's my responsibility. I try really hard, but I just forget. So, patrons, we have a lot of new ones too, so I want to say first, hello, welcome to everybody. For the patrons who have been enjoying the pre-show, I hope you've been enjoying the pre-show, because everybody who's a patron $5 and up gets that. And to everybody $10 and up, I get to say thank you by name. So, thank you to Victoria, Ree, I think it's Nico, I'm going to do really, really good to get all these names correct, Melissa, Maria, Kat, Doitsu, Ariel, or Ariel, I'm never sure which, Jay, Evan, Barry, and Amy Monster. Thanks, guys. We appreciate you so much. Even if I forget you guys a lot of the time, I'm sorry.
So, this has been Georgina Rose. You can find me under .darling, D-A-A-T, after the Sephora, not the fabric. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Patreon.
Yep. This has been Nike. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok sometimes, YouTube. That's my big one. Come hang out with me. I've also got Discord and Patreon and stuff. It's a whole good time. So I'm cool.
And I'm Temperance. You can find me at Wildwoman Witchcraft, pretty much on every social media platform that exists. My book, Year of the Witch, is available anywhere books are sold. And this has been Occultism with a Side of Salt!